3, 2, 1. Hello, and welcome back to On Global Leadership's workshop, Doing Business in Today's China. In today's session, session 3, we're going to be talking about manufacturing power and partnerships. To give you a brief review of our framework or how we think about China, we believe it's very important to begin with history. This isn't a history course or a culture course, but understanding China's culture and understanding the culture, the values, norms, and behaviors of the people who sit across the table from you when you're trying to do business in China is important. And that culture sits on a bedrock of a very long and important history. China is also an important geopolitical entity. We typically think of China as a massive nation, the world's most populous nation, headquartered by Beijing, and that's true. But China is also internally a very complex system. It's a system of provinces, municipalities, townships, villages, all of which are incentivized and oriented towards building their own path in contributing to China's economic transformation. China is the home of the most complex and sophisticated manufacturing supply chain in the world. And we're going to spend some time today talking about that specifically. And over the last 40 years, we've seen China just transform. Since the economic opening in 1979 under Deng Xiaoping, when China was really in a difficult position in the post-Mao era, China has transformed itself to return to its position as a major geopolitical player in the global scene. And that's an important part of understanding how to do business in China today as well. Our philosophy and learning outcomes, again, just a brief review, but we believe it's very important to understand Chinese culture, and that culture lies on a bedrock of a very long history. We also believe it's very important to spend time thinking about the complexities of China's political economy and the ways in which China has transformed itself economically and politically over the last 4 decades of economic reform. Finally, we believe as a group of teachers that real-world examples and experiences are the best guiding posts for understanding what's happening in China today. So we try to bring our own experiences, what we call boots on the ground experiences, as examples of what it is that we're observing in China today and what we want to help you observe in China today. We've been through session 1 already. We gave a brief introduction of our team, but the real heart of that session was on culture and history. Session 2, we talked about China's political economy. And in today's session, session 3, we're going to talk about manufacturing power and partnerships. Now, what does that mean, manufacturing power and partnerships? This is an important topic. We believe it's fundamental to understanding doing business in China today. The simplistic views of China often depict it or think of it as just the home of a very deep, cheap labor pool. As the world's most populous nation, there's a lot of people who want to work. And indeed, when China entered the economic reforms in 1979, there were about 800 million people living in abject poverty. I mean, that's more than 2 times the size of the entire US population. And so that's a lot of people to put to work. And certainly it's true that that's part of the fuel of China's power in the manufacturing supply chain, but it's only a very small piece of the puzzle. And so what we're going to try to illuminate today is the complexities of what that manufacturing power is about. And we're also going to spend some time emphasizing just how important partnerships are today. So the key takeaways that we really want you to come away from this session with are: 1, China is the home of the most complex and sophisticated manufacturing supply chain in the world, bar none. Often we think about this big, deep, cheap labor pool, and superficial observers might say, well, you know, if things get difficult with China, we can just go produce things in India. And our view is that depicts a very superficial understanding of what's actually happened in China. This isn't just about a deep, cheap labor pool. It's about 40 years of building a very complex, innovative, and integrated manufacturing supply chain that it would take decades to build anywhere else in the world. In the last decade, the internal politics that govern that supply chain have changed in significant ways. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that means for doing business in China today. There are new laws and regulations that have fundamentally changed the ways in which foreign investors need to operate in China today. And the key thing that we want you to walk away from this session with is partnership, partnership, partnership. Partnership is key. And so this is a really important part of the discussion today, and we'll come back to give a little more nuance to exactly what that means as we go over this topic. So elements of the world's most dynamic supply chain. Let's dive in. Okay, the first issue is the deep, cheap labor pool. Again, when China entered the economic reforms under Deng Xiaoping's leadership in 1979, there were about 800 million people living in abject poverty. And so there's a lot of people to put to work, a lot of hunger for working for relatively low wages by the world standards. But it's important to note that this isn't just about labor supply. The migrant labor force is an important part of this topic. In China, it's called the floating population, 流动人口. And what that means is that this is a population of people that move around the country. And actually, this process is facilitated by the government itself. So if you think about seasonal labor, say in agriculture, sometimes large agricultural producers need more intensive labor, more employees, because seasonal production, right? Manufacturing has the same logic to it. So if you think about a company like Apple, which is an example that we're going to talk about today, Apple releases about one new iPhone a year. And what that means is that there's a massive spike in the need for labor for a short amount of time. And so the population moves to Foxconn Zhengzhou, and that population swells, doubles, triples, even quadruples for about 3 months. But that labor force doesn't become a financial liability for the producers, in this case, Foxconn, of the final assembly product. And so the migrant labor force and the fact that this is a labor force that moves around the country is a very important part of one of the key advantages that China has in the building of this manufacturing supply chain. And so when we think about this, we're talking about, again, 350 million people that float around the country. And it's a very powerful part of the supply chain process in China. But this isn't just a deep, cheap labor pool. China has done a fantastic job over the last 40 years of vocational technical education. So, one of the ways that you become a very powerful manufacturing supply chain is not just by having people sit in front of sewing machines making textiles. A lot of the supply lines for a number of the different kinds of products that exist in China and are produced in China are very complex. And so training a technical vocational labor force is an important part of building a very complex manufacturing supply chain. And China has done a fabulous job over the last 40 years of building that vocational labor force. And so that's an important part of this, of the manufacturing supply chain question. China has also undertaken a massive investment in national infrastructure. Now, why is that important? It's important because when you want to have a manufacturing supply chain that is very efficient, it needs to be integrated, right? And so being integrated depends on what? It depends on things like roads. It depends on not just shipping lanes and places where you send things out, but it actually depends on getting product from one factory to another. Because usually it's the case that factories specialize in very specific things, components, modules, final assembly. And so having the infrastructure to move product around China actually has been a very, very powerful part of building this incredibly efficient manufacturing supply chain. Now, let's talk about the current environment. When we're talking about the current environment, we're talking about the last decade, from about 2013 to 2023. If we kind of take a step back and just think in our political economy session, you'll recall that we talked about breaking China's economic reforms down into roughly into epochs of reform that mapped onto the leaders of a given period. And so you have the period of Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s. And then you have the period of Jiang Zemin in the 1990s. And the shift between what Deng Xiaoping was emphasizing and what Jiang Zemin emphasized was significant. The 1990s were really defined by the effort to attract foreign capital. The leadership didn't just want China to be a heart of cheap labor, but wanted to attract capital so that foreign investors would be committed to China, and technology transfer was a big part of those investment deals. In 2001, China entered the World Trade Organization, and at that time, it became illegal for China to have what is called a quid pro quo for market access. And what does that mean? That means if you want to be in China and you want to produce stuff in China, you have to show up and do a joint venture and transfer technology, or whatever it was that would give you access to the supply chain and to the market. 2001, that became off limits, at least officially. And so what we saw in the era of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao in the 2000s was a very, very, a much more laissez-faire environment. And so you sort of saw an opening of the doors, China's entry into the WTO, no more quid pro quo for market access. And you had a number of different companies entering China with very little regulatory control by the Chinese government over what they were doing. In the current era, under Xi Jinping and his administration, we've seen rolling back of the clock in some ways. China is still in the WTO, so there still can't be an official quid pro quo for market access, but there's been a lot of changes that have put a lot more pressure on foreign investors, and this is what we want to help illuminate for people who are with us on this intellectual journey. So what's happened in the current environment? So in 2013, China entered a period that was oriented towards developing its position in the world that was beyond just being a manufacturer and an exporter. So we see the Belt and Road Initiative. We see an engagement in what we might think of as a return in some ways to China's position of power. You'll remember in the first lecture, when we talked about a brief history, we talked about how dominant China was under Admiral Zheng He, who was the admiral who ran China's armada in the Ming Dynasty. And this was a time when, you'll recall, we used the example Columbus set sail with 3 ships of about 90 sailors total, 90-foot ships. Admiral Zheng He would typically set sail with 400-foot ships, hundreds of ships in his armada, and sail the seas and kind of control the world. The Belt and Road Initiative isn't exactly hearkening back to that, but it is an opportunity for China to actually think much more broadly about its engagement with the global economy as it continues to develop its manufacturing prowess, but then face outward. And so we've seen this during this time period as an important area of emphasis for what was happening in China. We've also seen a number of different legal changes that are very important. Now, in the West, we have a concept called rule of law. What does rule of law typically mean? In a capitalist democracy, we think of rule of law as you have a set of legal principles that govern an economy, right? And if there's a dispute over how an economic actor is acting, you have those principles adjudicated by a court, and you have a rational legal outcome. China's system uses the term rule of law, but typically China scholars like to make the distinction between rule of law versus rule by law. And you'll remember when we were talking about China's history in session 1, we introduced an individual, a philosopher named Han Feizi. And Han Fei was an individual who thought about the importance of law. You remember we had a slide up that had both Han Fei and Qin Shi Huangdi, the first Qin emperor. And it was an important time to think about, yes, it's important for rulers, even if they're authoritarian rulers, to have laws. But these laws are not adjudicated by courts. They're laws they're legal structures that force economic actors to do what you want them to do. So rule of law is a little bit distinct from rule by law. Now, in China, in the last decade, we've seen a number of different laws and regulations that have come out to really shape the way economic actors are operating in the economy. Probably the first of these that was really of note was China's anti-corruption campaign, which officially was kicked off in 2012. And Wang Qishan was a leader of this campaign, but it was an important time to really signal to the economy that corruption was not okay. We are going to have an economy that is a fair and well-governed economy, and it would continue to develop, but people who were caught in corrupt behavior would be punished. And so the anti-corruption campaign became an important way of thinking about how the economy was going to be governed. And again, it was a signal. It was a signal to say, here's how we're going to be in the decade going forward. We also saw an important law come out. It was a reform called the Labor Dispatch System Reform. Now, what does labor dispatch mean? Now, this actually relates directly to this issue that I talked about that was so important, the migrant labor force. So the labor dispatch system is the ways in which the government governs and facilitates the movement of the migrant labor force around the country, right? And so the labor dispatch system set up a set of principles by which governed the ways in which corporate actors, whether they were Chinese corporate actors or foreign firms, could use this migrant labor force. And it caught a lot of corporations' attention at the time because the reforms of this system were much tighter than a number of corporations realized. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes with some of the examples that we're going to bring up. Another law which was important in changing the dynamics and sending signals to the new economy that was emerging in the 2000s. And in the 2000s internally in China, we see, well, Alibaba was actually founded in the late 1990s, but we see the emergence and prominence of companies like Alibaba and Tencent and a number of other Chinese companies. And we also see the entry of companies like Apple into China in 2001. And so the 2000s were a period in which we saw a lot of transformation that was happening, not just in the manufacturing supply chain, but also in the engagement in the new economy. And the Chinese cybersecurity law of 2016 really set a tone of, in some ways, governing and reining this part of the economy in very significant ways. It's also important just to think about the different aspects of leverage that China has in governing supply chains. So you have this rule by law system that is emerging and was very aggressively set in place over the last decade. But China is also an interesting case because of the ways in which it's been engaged with a number of different bedrocks, if you will, of the production of a number of different goods. So China is the single largest producer and refiner of rare earths in the global economy. And so this gives China a tremendous amount of leverage over different companies that want to interact with China. Just to give you one example of this, in 2011 or 2012, there was a dust up between China and Japan in the East China Sea. And amazingly, Sony, which is a major Japanese company, of course, suddenly found it wasn't able to get access to neodymium. Now, not being an engineer myself, I had to do some research and some learning on what that meant and why it was so important. But neodymium is a rare earth that China produces about 97% of the neodymium in the world. And neodymium is critical for building the magnets that go inside of earphones. And again, I'm not technically attuned to exactly how this works, but suffice it to say that Sony can't make its earphones without neodymium. China controls 90% of the neodymium production in the world. And so suddenly a major company couldn't get access to neodymium. And so again, here's how economics and politics come up against each other and butt heads. At the time, a little bit after this, and I'm going to talk about Apple as an example, but I was paying attention to these kinds of issues and wanting to educate Apple executives on them, because Sony has their own earphones, Apple has their own version of earphones as well. And so being attuned to what China's areas of leverage were in the products that were being built in China and were emerging from China was an important part of the lessons for major global corporations, including companies like Sony and Apple. Now, here again, it's really important to note that this isn't just about a deep, cheap labor pool. And it's not just about China's governance of the supply chain, but China has prided itself on being a major innovator in building a complex manufacturing supply chain. So there's the floating population and the investment in infrastructure to link factories together for the flow of components and modules and goods across the country. But there's also been a huge emphasis in China on having an innovative supply chain. And what does that mean? Remember that, as we discussed in session 2, Beijing produces these 5-year plans, and there are major goals and ideas behind these 5-year plans. And those goals are important guiding posts for the direction the country is going to go and the goals that it wants to achieve. China is not fundamentally a centralized system in which whatever Beijing says goes. Beijing lays the groundwork, but then local officials at the province, municipal, and township levels are incentivized to actually be entrepreneurial, be innovative, build industrial clusters so that they can actually contribute to the economic growth in their small piece of the pie. It's a system that we like. When we write about this, we borrowed from the great China scholar Andy Walder, and what he wrote in 1994, talking about this system, where what he called local governments as industrial firms. And so again, we already talked about this in session 2, but if you think about China as a massive global conglomerate, headquarters are in Beijing, but the local governments are all incentivized to deliver on their KPIs that contribute to the growth of the whole. And it was very interesting. In 2015, Li Keqiang gave a talk at Davos, and he spent a lot of time talking about entrepreneurship and innovation. And typically when people hear those terms, entrepreneurship and innovation together, they think of companies like Alibaba, Yahoo, Google, Tencent, these kinds of, and that's not wrong. But it's also really important to understand that there was a very strong emphasis here, not just on entrepreneurship and innovation in the high-tech sector, but on entrepreneurship and innovation in the manufacturing supply chain. And, you know, again, this was a talk that Li Keqiang gave at Davos in 2015, but it's for those of us who have spent time studying this supply chain and advising companies on how to manage and make their way through it. It's very clear that China takes a lot of pride in the entrepreneurial action and the innovation in the building of this supply chain. Now, we're going to dive into a couple of different cases here. For my part, I'm going to talk about the case that I know the best, because I've spent a significant amount of time working for Apple in China, and as the head of Apple University, it was my job to help advise the executive team on how to navigate the Chinese market. When we go to the At the end of the session, we're going to hear from the rest of the experts on the ground in China who have worked with many, many different companies in helping them manage the manufacturing supply chain. But let's talk about Apple for a few minutes, again, because it's just the case that I know the most detail about in terms of what they were experiencing in this time period for doing business in China today. So everybody knows that China is one of the most profitable companies in the world. Most people think, and in my own experience, even executives at Apple think, well, so my favorite statistic on Apple is that Apple has about 30% of the smartphone market share in the world. So 1 in 3 people in the world have an iPhone. But Apple takes about 90% of the profits in that market segment. 30% of the market share, 90% of the profits. How is that possible? Now, a lot of Apple executives and a lot of people around the world would say, well, that's because, they make these great products, they're very innovative, and they can charge more money than Samsung can. Both of which are true, but that's not the reason Apple is the most profitable company in the world. The reason Apple is the most profitable company in the world is because of the ways in which it navigates China's manufacturing supply chain. And so Apple's business model is much different than many other companies because it hasn't set up joint ventures, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, but instead it has created this competitive environment in which tacit knowledge is passed from Apple ops engineers to the suppliers that they work with. And what we mean by tacit knowledge is knowledge know-how for how to run an efficient manufacturing supply chain. And so basically a lot of the suppliers will work with Apple for zero margins so that they can then turn around and make their money from Huawei, Oppo, Vivo, Xiaomi, Samsung, and everybody else. And so I just want to raise this example because it actually tells us a little bit about how you can be successful in managing the manufacturing supply chain, but also what some of the risks have become over the last decade. So I'll go through this example quickly because we don't want to spend too much time on Apple, but Apple became a very powerful player in China. And again, Tim Cook took Apple into China in 2001. He was the chief operating officer at that time under Steve Jobs, and very, very smart and very sophisticated in how he thought about and what he saw in the potential for navigating the manufacturing supply chain. And both this company and China itself just transformed dramatically over the course of this time period. And of course, Apple's products are popular in China. And so, China is Apple's second largest market. And, this is a fun picture of an iPhone release in, I think it was like 2012 in Sanlitun. And you can just, throngs of people are crowding an Apple retail center because they want to get access to this thing. So there is a story here about Apple's success with the consumer markets in China, but that's not the real story here. Again, the story is about the management of the manufacturing supply chain. Now, the interesting thing is, again, in the 2000s, it was sort of open doors under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, China's entry into the WTO. Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao come to power in 2002. China had just entered the WTO in 2001. And, companies like Apple could sort of do as they chose to do in navigating the manufacturing supply chain. In 2013, things changed. So, of course, 2013, March 14th, 2013, Xi Jinping is inaugurated as the new president of China. And this was an interesting and important moment for China and for Apple in China. So just an interesting moment of an interesting footnote on timing. So President Xi is inaugurated on March 14th, 2013. Every year in China has something called Consumer Day. This was actually something started in the early 1980s, I think maybe 1983 under Deng Xiaoping. And Consumer Day was set up to highlight the idea that even though China is embarking down a path of capitalism, the Communist Party still wanted to send a signal that it was protecting workers and protecting Chinese consumers. And so every year in mid-March, in the Ides of March, some company would be called out for bad behavior in terms of its operation in China, in terms of its treatment of Chinese consumers, et cetera. And in 2013, it was Apple's turn. And, you know, executives in Apple, I joined Apple shortly thereafter, and, you know, people were sort of like, well, you know, whatever, like, yeah, it was going to be our turn at some point. But they didn't really take as seriously as I did at the time what this actually meant. This was a signal. This was a shot across the bow. And as somebody who's been watching China for many, many years, I was fascinated with what was actually happening and what this turn in the road in the transition from President Hu to President Xi was going to mean for foreign corporations operating in China. And so at first there were the warranty policies, there was a fine for underpaying taxes, and Apple then sort of thought it was done. However, shortly thereafter, there was a study that was done. Now, these two institutions, you may not have heard of them, but they're very important institutions in China. One is the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, 中国社会科学院, and the other is an organization called Guozhiwei, which is the State-Owned Asset Supervision and Administration Commission. So in terms of the social science research, you have the most important entity on the right. And in terms of sort of the governance of the economy, the State-Owned Asset Supervision and Administration Commission, very, very powerful also. Okay, so these two organizations came together to do a study. And what did they want to do a study on? They wanted to do a study on all foreign firms that were investing in China and how good as citizens they were. So they were doing a study on what many have heard of and would call corporate social responsibility, essentially corporate citizenship. Now, when this study was coming out, Apple executives were actually very excited because they think of themselves as really, really good citizens in the world, and they do everything they can for supplier responsibility, et cetera. And so they were assuming that this would be fine. I had just recently joined the company, and so I was sort of listening into what they were expecting and the anticipation of this report. And so two competitors, Intel and Samsung, they did well. They were in the top 10 of organizations. They got a scoring chart of 100. They both had about 83 in terms of what their scoring tabulation was. And Apple executives were astounded to learn that they did horribly on this assessment. Their corporate social responsibility rating was in the low 40s in terms of the rankings of foreign firms operating in China. And they got a paltry score of, I think it was about 27. And it was, again, a real signal like, you guys think you're great, but you're not so great. And Apple executives were left scratching their head like, what are we doing wrong? What's happening? We're such good citizens. And so part of my job was to help them figure out. So here's the official rankings, and you can see one of the things that's interesting. So Apple came up as number 46 in the rankings of foreign companies operating in China. One of the things that's really important to notice here is that every single company that's ranked in the top 10 has the word 中国 that is tied to the foreign Chinese entity that operates in China. Now, what does that mean? Number 8 doesn't have 中国, but it does have 集团, which means group company, right? And so what does this mean? It means that China wasn't just looking at corporate social responsibility. China was looking also at the ways in which companies were building their presence through partnerships in China, right? So when a foreign company would invest in China, the common practice in the 1990s was to set up an entity that was what's called a 合资企业, or a joint venture. And so that venture would have a foreign entity and the Chinese entity, and they would create a new entity that would then have the name China in it. And it would operate as a joint entity between the Chinese and the foreign company. Apple, you'll notice, has no China in its title. It just says Apple Company, 苹果公司. And this to me, when I saw this report, it kind of raised some red flags because I thought, this is really maybe what's happening here. And of course, at this time, when this report came out, there were lots of things that kind of went across the Chinese internet. There was Tencent, big differences between CSR efforts by foreign and Chinese enterprises. Apple falls far behind while Samsung rises rapidly. Why doesn't Apple do charity in China? Wang Chao was very, very strident in stating that Apple is never going to be successful in China because they don't give back. And this raised for me, as somebody who was advising the executives of Apple, a key issue, but it's an issue that we believe as a team is really important for China today, and that's the issue of partnership. Partnership is so important in China. And again, dating back to the 1990s, this was explicitly emphasized. If you want to be in China, you better show up and you better do a joint venture and you better transfer technology. And then in the 2000s, that sentiment sort of went by the wayside. It was brought back in very strong terms in the current era in China. And so let's look a little bit about what partnership looks like in China. So there are sort of a hierarchy of relationships, ways in which foreign firms can show up in China. In the 1980s, you saw a lot of companies coming to China and just setting up rep offices. They would rent out hotel rooms and they would send out representative offices, and they would just, send a couple of staff over there and they would, just set up operations. There's also a concept of a trading company. Now, for some Chinese people who have a strong sensitivity of Chinese history, trading company is not such a good word. The term is Maui Gongsi. And the reason it's not such a good word is because of the history of trading companies in China. So remember, we talked about the beginning of, if you remember the history lesson that we had, the beginning of China's century of humiliation, which really was marked as beginning in 1839, which was the beginning of the first Opium War. And the first Opium War was launched by Britain, but it was at the behest of the Dutch East India Trading Company. And so the history of trading companies in China just takes people's minds back to the century of humiliation. In the 90s, it became much more common to either have a wholly foreign-owned enterprise. Back then, it was called a wholly owned foreign enterprise, WOFE or WFOE, it's the same. And a holding company, a Jituan Gongsi. But then the sort of capstone of investment in China was the joint venture, the Heziqiye. And remember, the joint venture is when you have a foreign company and a Chinese company, they become partners and they build a separate entity. And that entity then becomes the joint venture. And usually there's schedules for transfer of technology and lots of both explicit learning in the technology, but also tacit knowledge and tacit learning through the venture. In 2001, we see the emergence of a new kind of company called the Foreign Investment Corporate Enterprise. And again, it sort of fits in this system of what it looks like to show up for different companies in China. Now, again, when I was helping Apple executives think about this, I was pointing out to them, look at all of the entities that Apple has in China. And executives say, we have lots of entities here and we're doing lots of business here. China loves us. But if you sort of thought through, the biggest company in China was a trading company. And then all of the retail stores were in the FICE category. Apple Pay and iTunes were in the FICE category. And Apple did in 2015 start to build R&D centers. But they were somewhere in between the FICE category and the wholly foreign-owned enterprise category. So none of the sort of high-level positioning that a lot of companies have had in China. Now, if you think about how China thinks about this hierarchy of entities, on the x-axis, you have perceived commitment, low to high. And rep offices are very low perceived commitment. And joint venture is very high in the perceived commitment category. If you're doing a joint venture in China, it looks to the Chinese government, local officials and national officials like you're all in. On the y-axis, you have perceived benefit, low to high. And here again, rep offices at the bottom, trading companies at the bottom. It just looks like you're there to make money, but you're not really there to give back. And then you kind of go up, and again, joint ventures are sort of at the top of this hierarchy. And this notion of giving back is very important. Today, the words partnership, we want you to walk away from this session with, but also the term in China for China. This is a very, very strong sentiment in China today of, you know, if you're going to be a foreign investor working in China, what are you doing for us? You're not just, you can't be just here to make money. What are you doing that is in China for China? Some partnerships are necessary. If you want to produce automobiles, Shanghai GM went through this, and you know, they needed a big joint venture, and they set that up, and it was headquartered in Shanghai, and it was an important part of GM's presence in China. If you want to do content, you've got to have major partnerships that allow you to build what it is that you're doing. And building a theme park in China required that Disney became a major partner of the Pudong government. Tesla is an interesting case because it's the first automobile company, first foreign company in the automobile industry that was allowed to enter China without setting up a joint venture. So their venture is a WOFE, a wholly foreign owned enterprise. But be sure that Tesla's engagement and its partnership with the Shanghai government is very, very strong and very powerful. And so again, there are just these different approaches, but all of these are about partnership. Now, this is not to say that even if you do set up the right partnerships, that things won't get difficult. Companies like DuPont and Motorola, Yahoo, Google, they ran into many, many problems in China. And so partnerships doesn't mean that the problems all go away. But it's an important thing to understand that partnership was critical in the 1990s. It became less of a note to hit in the 2000s, but it is back. And so partnership, very important. And so one of the things that we want to give here, because this workshop is called Doing Business in China Today, in the last decade, we've seen a return to the partnership pressures of the 1990s. And, you know, if you just sort of go through this period, 2015, 2016, 17, 18, up through the early 20s, we saw HP setting up a major joint venture with Tsinghua University. We saw Dell's commitment, very, very, you know, loud mouthpiece of trumpeting its investment of 125 billion in the Chinese market. Microsoft's joint venture, IBM's joint venture, and what people were thinking about that process. Qualcomm, Cisco, and on and on. And so this was an important thing. Again, I was working inside of Apple at the time, and so that's the case that I know best. And I was, you know, holding these examples up to Apple executives, and they kept saying, like, we're fine, we don't need to be doing this. But again, note, if we go back to the 1990s, this was explicit, much less so in the 2000s, but in the last decade, we've seen a real return to this notion that the Chinese government has long focused on technology transfer as the ultimate end for foreign firms helping Chinese society. So in China for China, technology transfer is key. Now, how does this look in China? So again, this is to give you a sense of what the joint venture details are. So you have a foreign firm that's a foreign investor in China. You have a Chinese partner. They come together and they build a separate new organization, which is called the joint venture, the Heziqiye, joint venture company. And this kind of venture is very important because what we see in this kind of venture is we see the flow of technology into the joint venture. And then we see the capture of technology by the Chinese partner because of the technology flowing in. So remember, the books in this joint venture are open. So everything that's happening inside of the joint venture that's coming from the foreign investor, the Chinese partner has access to, and that creates the benefit. So we see the flow of technology through the joint venture, but in the end, the Chinese partner ends up with the technology. Now, remember our CSR report, right? And so Samsung and Intel were top of the list. They were in the top 10. And if you look at Samsung's organizational structure in China, again, that list was about corporate social responsibility. So we think of environment and labor practices, et cetera. But what that list was really about is, are you in China for China? Are you helping us? Right. And so when I was sort of looking at this back then, it was amazing to look at it. So Samsung has 39 manufacturing facilities that are either JVs or WOFEs, right? And so there's a lot of that business model that we just showed on the previous slide. It had set up 10 research centers, 44 sales entities, 73 corporate branches. I mean, it was a major, major investment, and it was very clearly sending a signal to the Chinese government, like, we are in China for China. Do not worry about us. Now, Apple, which again likes to think of itself as being a great corporate citizen and, you know, doing wonderful things for all the societies that it operates in, not just through product, but also through things like environmental standards and supplier responsibility. But Apple's also very secretive, so they were not good at telling the Chinese government about what they were doing. They just thought if they were doing it, then that would be fine. But note that Apple's business model is very different than Samsung's, right? Because Apple didn't have any joint ventures, zero. So there was no sort of sense that, oh, you're working with a Chinese partner and you're transferring technology. Now, the Apple executives would argue, and we did later, that they were transferring a lot of tacit knowledge. And what we mean by tacit knowledge is know-how, business know-how. So in the academic literature, we call this tacit knowledge, but what it really means is just business know-how. And so when Apple would embed its operations engineers into whatever partner won the business with them for the production of a component or a module or even final assembly, this would be very good for these companies. So going back to the statistic that we talked about, Apple, 1/3 of the smartphone market share in the world, 90% of the profits. It's because those suppliers wanted to pay. So they would work for very, very low margins, often zero margins, so that they could gain the tacit knowledge from Apple ops engineers being embedded in their factories. So it's a powerful model, but it just wasn't well known in China. And, you know, I mean, this was a model that was hitting a lot of Chinese suppliers, about 1,500 partner organizations working with Apple in China in this time period. But remember our standard JV model, you have the foreign investor, the Chinese partner, the joint venture, and then the flow of technology. But the Apple model, at least as the Chinese government saw it, was there's no joint venture. There's just the making of your components, modules, and final assembly products. So what do we get? What are we getting out of it? And the government didn't have a good awareness, and Apple didn't do a good job at selling the tacit knowledge that was being delivered. And so again, if you think of the standard JV model, it's really based on being in China for China, tech transfer. If you look at the Apple model, Apple ops leaders were saying, well, we're doing a ton because we're bringing all this process management, confidence, credibility, efficiency, responsibility. We're embedding people, ops engineers, into these places to help the supply line managers of these firms do better, right? And that's why they're turning around and making so much money from other competitors in the market. But the Chinese government just didn't see it. And so one of the things that had to happen was Apple had to get better at selling that model. They had to start talking about their partnerships. And so one of the projects I did for Apple was to really try to go around and interview the leaders of the operators in the supply chain and get them to talk about partnership. So we'll just end the Apple story with one story, and then we'll move on to our other experts on the ground in China and hear their stories. But I love the story of Apple and Lens, because when you ask people, what was the major innovation of the iPhone? Often people who are very knowledgeable about the product will say touchscreen glass, right? That was the big thing that Steve Jobs said, like, here are Blackberries with plastic screens. We are going to make touchscreen glass, which is going to revolutionize the way you can interact by touching with your little device. And this is one of the things that I think is just interesting about thinking about China as a sophisticated manufacturing supply chain. It's all fine and good to have some corporate leader or some brilliant, innovative engineer in Cupertino come up with an idea for a product. It's a totally different prospect to think about scaling that product for production, right? So it was true that Steve Jobs and Apple ops engineers in Cupertino came up with the idea of touchscreen glass, and they even designed prototypes for the product. But scaling production on that process, it didn't exist. It was non-existent in 2005, 2006. And so to me, the story I like to tell is actually the real innovation of the iPhone wasn't Steve Jobs and ops and innovation R&D engineers in Cupertino. It was Zhou Shunfei of Lens. Who's Zhou Shunfei? She's the CEO of a very powerful company called Lens, and she's been in the news at various times. This story dates back to 2015, but she's one of the richest women in China. And she's the CEO of this little company called Lens. And Lens was the company that figured out how to mass produce touchscreen glass, right? So again, if you think about the complexity of this supply chain, people often think like, well, Foxconn makes Apple's products. No, Foxconn's just final assembly. You have components, you have modules, and touchscreen glass is somewhere between a component and a module, and you have final assembly. But somebody has to mass produce that touchscreen glass, and Zhou Chunfei was her company that figured out how to do it, and then of course that spread to other partners across the supply chain. But they were the key. This caption says, Zhou Chunfei, the founder of Lens Technology and China's richest woman, has slept in a room or in her office for the past 2 years. Such is her dedication to the job. So when I interviewed her, I wanted to ask this question. I wanted to say, but so you don't have a joint venture with Apple, but do you consider yourself partners? And I loved the way she spoke about this with such passion. She said, she would tell me a story. I remember when Jeff Williams, who was the COO of Apple at the time, he would fly over to China, and we would just sleep in the factory next to the supply lines just to figure out how we could maximize time in learning together. And she very passionately said to me in one interview, of course we're partners, for sure. There are different kinds of customers. Some are passing relationships, some are a little deeper than that. And then there's the one relationship that you fall in love and get married. We're married to Apple. I think we have a strong enough sense of the future together. We feel like the partnership is strong. We feel very supported by Apple. I guess some of the issue is that we feel a lot of pressure sometimes. And there is a lot of pressure around cost, but Apple's fair. And we have all been working together so long. We were all comfortable with the dynamic. And so it was this kind of dynamic that we wanted to get out there, because there is one type of partnership that everybody recognizes, which is the joint venture partnership. But there's many ways to build value in the supply chain, and tacit knowledge was one of them. And so tacit knowledge around the ways in which to produce and cut the glass that would become touchscreen glass. Apple also helped Zhou Chunfei and Lens think about environmental protection and the water recycling system that was built there. And the interesting thing is, once we got better at portraying exactly what Apple was doing for suppliers in the supply chain, our victory lap came when we got a revised score. So Apple's score went from 25.3 to 67.5. And remember, again, this was supposed to be a score on corporate social responsibility. How are you doing in supply chain management in terms of the treatment of labor and in terms of environmental protection? But what it was really about was messaging out, how much are you partners? How much are you helping Chinese partners? And that was the story. And the story that we want to emphasize to you is that this is the way you do business in China. So this is Apple's revised score, and everybody was very happy about it. But the key issue that we want you to take away here is partnership, partnership, partnership in China for China. Okay. Doing business in China today is a complex process, and there's tremendous amounts of resources to benefit from. There's the migrant labor force, the floating population. There's the very sophisticated and complex manufacturing supply chain that's integrated very well with a massive infrastructure investment over the last 40 years. But there's also this very innovative supply chain of industrial clusters that are built in different townships and municipalities. But you must show up and illuminate the ways in which you are partners in China. So to come back to our key takeaways for this session, China's home to the most complex and sophisticated manufacturing supply chain in the world. Hopefully that concept comes clear in this session. The internal politics that govern that supply chain have changed in significant ways in the last decade. And the new laws and regulations have fundamentally changed the ways in which foreign investors need to operate in China. But again, the final point is the most important part. In China for China, partnership is key. You must show up and make clear how you are helping China and how that's a part of your business model and business plan. So with that, I will end my comments, and we will turn now to our experts on the ground in China and hear what they have to say. Thank you very much, and I look forward to talking to you again in session 4.